Sarah Mitchell gently rubbed her swollen belly while seated in first class. The 45-year-old retired Air Force major, heading to Geneva for a final military medical technology handover, had no idea that a simple meal request would expose shocking discrimination and change everything. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another first-class passenger on Stratus Air Flight 917. She was a decorated Air Force major with 22 years of distinguished service, now 7 months pregnant with her miracle baby at 45. Something doctors had once told her would be impossible due to injuries sustained during her third deployment. Dressed in a modest Navy maternity dress that contrasted with the flashy attire of other passengers, Sarah carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from years of military discipline. The silver oak leaf pin on her lapel, her subtle nod to her service, went unnoticed by most, but was part of who she was. After retiring from active duty, Sarah had founded Meditech Solutions, a company specializing in combat medical technology that had saved thousands of military lives. Her current trip to Geneva wasn't just another business meeting. She was finalizing a critical medical equipment contract that would protect soldiers in combat zones. Despite her accomplishments, Sarah remained humble. Her colleagues describe her as brilliant yet approachable, a leader who elevated everyone around her without seeking the spotlight. This humility was cultivated during her years as one of the few black female officers in her unit, where she'd learned to let her work speak for itself. As she settled into her seat, Sarah reviewed her presentation one last time. The merger will provide cutting-edge trauma equipment to NATO forces, potentially saving countless lives. Her mind raced with final preparations while her hand absently traced circles on her belly, a habit she developed since learning she was pregnant. What Sarah didn't know was that this routine flight would become a battlefield of a different kind, one that would test her resolve not as a soldier or business leader, but as a black woman still fighting for basic dignity in spaces where some believed she didn't belong. The first-class cabin of Stratus Air exuded luxury, leather seats, champagne, and attentive service, creating an atmosphere of privilege. Sarah had pre-ordered her meal days ago, a specific high-protein option recommended by her doctor for her pregnancy-related anemia. It wasn't about luxury. It was about necessity. The flight attendant, Lisa, moved to the cabin with practiced efficiency, serving drinks to other passengers with warm smiles. When she reached Sarah, however, her demeanor shifted subtly. The smile remained, but didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely when Lisa passed by again without taking her order. "I pre-ordered a special meal. Could you please check on it?" Lisa's response was immediate and dismissive. "I'm sorry, but we don't have record of any special orders for you. You'll have to choose from the regular menu." Sarah blinked, momentarily confused. "There must be some mistake. I confirmed it yesterday. It's medically necessary due to my pregnancy." The flight attendant's gaze briefly flicked to Sarah's belly, then away. "As I said, there's nothing in our system. Perhaps you forgot to confirm it?" Her tone suggested Sarah was confused rather than the airline being at fault. Before Sarah could respond, Lisa hurried away, returning moments later with a meager sandwich and tap water, placing them unceremoniously on Sarah's tray. "This is all we can offer you right now." Sarah watched as the attendant moved to the next passenger, a white businessman, and presented him with an elaborate meal of caviar and champagne with flourish. "Your pre-ordered meal, sir, exactly as requested." Looking around the cabin, Sarah noticed she was the only black passenger in first class. Every other passenger had received their pre-ordered meals, elaborate dishes served with care and attention to detail. The contrast was striking. It wasn't just a meal. It was a dismissive tone, the lack of eye contact, the absence of options or apology. Sarah had experienced this kind of treatment before, both as a black woman and as a female officer. The same subtle cues that suggested she didn't belong, that her needs were less important, that her presence was an inconvenience. As she stared at the unappetizing sandwich, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not anger, but resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her child and the world they would inherit. Sarah didn't react immediately. 2 decades of military discipline had taught her to assess situations before responding. She took a slow, measured breath, the same technique she'd used during tense negotiations and in combat zones. Her mind flashed back to her early days in the Air Force, when a commanding officer had pulled her aside after she'd been overlooked for a training opportunity. "Mitchell," he'd said, "in this world, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as much. But when you respond to injustice, remember, strategy trumps emotion every time." Those words had guided her career. When facing discrimination, she'd learned not to lash out, but to systematically dismantle the barriers before her. Each promotion, each commendation had been earned through excellence that couldn't be denied. Now, as her baby kicked inside her, Sarah realized this wasn't just a fight anymore. She opened her tablet, accessing a secure channel to her company's legal team. With quick, efficient movements, she documented what had happened, her military training evident in her precise, factual account. No emotional language, just observable facts and times. A message notification appeared, her assistant checking in. Sarah typed a brief response. "Initiate Protocol Delta 7. Flight 917, Stratus Air. Need full crew manifest and service history. Priority level, immediate. Protocol Delta 7 wasn't just any procedure. It was a comprehensive background check her company had developed for vetting military contractors, capable of revealing patterns of behavior that might compromise mission integrity. Sarah had never used it outside of professional assessment before, but today was different. What the flight crew didn't realize was that Sarah Mitchell's company held exclusive contracts with 3 government agencies that accounted for 30% of Stratus Air's charter revenue. Her influence extended far beyond a single flight. Sarah closed her tablet and placed a protective hand over her belly. "This isn't the world you could grow up in," she whispered to her unborn child. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She pressed the call button again, her decision made. The battle had begun. For the next hour, Sarah moved with tactical precision. She sipped her water and documented everything: which passengers received what service, the time stamps, the different treatment patterns. Her military training had made her an expert observer, recording details others might miss. When the senior flight attendant, Mark, approached in response to her call button, Sarah's demeanor had changed. Gone was the polite passenger. Present now was the Air Force officer who commanded medical evacuation units in combat zones. "Sir," she began, her voice calm but commanding, "I'd like to understand Stratus Air's policy on confirmed meal orders." She didn't mention discrimination or pregnancy, just facts. Mark's response was practiced. "We always honor confirmed orders, ma'am." "Then perhaps you can explain why mine wasn't honored while every other passenger received their exact order?" Her question was pointed but professional. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure there was just a misunderstanding. Let me check." "The misunderstanding," Sarah interrupted gently, "appears to be systematic rather than incidental." She gestured subtly around the cabin. "I've observed a pattern of service discrepancy that raises concerns." Her clinical language clearly unsettled him. This wasn't the emotional complaint he was prepared to handle, but a methodical deconstruction of service failures. Before he could respond, Sarah's tablet chimed with an incoming message. The preliminary report from her team was comprehensive. 3 complaints had been filed against this crew in the past year, all from minority passengers in premium cabins. Lisa, the flight attendant who had served Sarah, had been specifically mentioned in 2 incidents. Meanwhile, Sarah's assistant had made contact with General Phillips at the Defense Logistics Agency, one of Stratus Air's biggest government clients and a longtime colleague of Sarah's. A quick conversation about service concerns had already traveled up Stratus Air's corporate chain. As the flight approached Geneva, Sarah received another message. Stratus Air's Vice President of Customer Experience would be meeting the flight personally. What had begun as a meal discrepancy had escalated into a corporate crisis. Sarah hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply activated the network of relationships and resources that she'd built through years of service and excellence. The systematic response to systematic discrimination was already in motion, invisible but unstoppable. As Flight 917 touched down in Geneva, the cabin crew began their usual landing announcements, unaware of what awaited them. Sarah remained in her seat, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Her expression serene despite the storm she'd set in motion. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the chief purser made an unusual announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain seated momentarily while we address a small matter." The confusion on the crew's faces made it clear this wasn't standard procedure. The aircraft door opened to reveal not the usual ground crew, but a delegation of suited individuals. Leading them was Eleanor Richardson, Stratus Air's executive vice president, alongside two members of the airline's HR department. Their presence on the jet bridge was unprecedented. Sarah gathered her belongings unhurriedly as Richardson boarded the plane, heading directly to the first-class cabin. The executive's eyes scanned the passengers before settling on Sarah. "Major Mitchell," Richardson said, extending her hand. "I apologize for interrupting your journey. May I have a word?" The other first-class passengers watched with curiosity as Sarah was escorted to the front galley. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, still unaware of the full situation. In the privacy of the galley, Richardson was direct. "Major, we've received concerning information about your experience today. This comes at a particularly sensitive time, as we're finalizing our contract renewal with the Defense Logistics Agency." What Sarah didn't mention was that General Phillips had already called the airline CEO directly, expressing concern about reports of discriminatory treatment toward a decorated veteran who happened to be a key military contractor. "Our entire service model is built on respect and excellence," Richardson continued. "What happened today reflects neither. I need you to know we're taking immediate action." As they spoke, the HR representatives were already gathering the flight crew at the rear of the aircraft. Lisa's face had drained the color as she realized who Sarah actually was. The transformation was immediate. The crew that had dismissed Sarah hours earlier now stood rigid with anxiety as they were informed they would not be continuing to their next assignment. Instead, they would be escorted to a review meeting with HR and senior management. Sarah hadn't sought revenge. She had sought accountability, and the system she had served faithfully for over 2 decades had responded in kind. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the final changes to the NATO medical equipment contract. A news alert popped up on her screen. Stratus Air announces new training program and policy overhaul. The airline had taken swift action following the incident. Lisa and 2 other crew members with histories of similar complaints had been terminated. More significantly, Stratus had implemented a comprehensive anti-discrimination training program, focusing specifically on unconscious bias against military personnel and minorities. Sarah had declined the airline's offer compensation, suggesting instead that they donate to a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members. The resulting Mitchell Integrity Scholarship would support education for military dependents for years to come. What had begun as a personal slight had become a catalyst for institutional change. Sarah had received hundreds of messages from fellow veterans and minority travelers sharing similar experiences and thanking her for taking a stand. The most meaningful response, however, came from within the airline itself. A group of Black Stratus employees had written to thank her for bringing these issues to light, noting that internal concerns had often been dismissed before the incident forced executive attention. General Phillips had called personally to inform her that the Defense Department was now including anti-discrimination metrics in its evaluation of all service contractors. "You turned a meal into a movement," he'd said with characteristic directness. Sarah's company had received a NATO contract, and the medical system she developed would soon protect soldiers across 3 continents. But she considered the Stratus Air incident equally important to her legacy. As she finished reviewing the contract, Sarah felt her baby kick vigorously. She smiled, placing her hand on her belly. "That's right, little one," she murmured. "That's how we fight. Not with anger, but with excellence. Not for revenge, but for change." The incident had reinforced what Sarah had always believed. True power wasn't about intimidation or dominance, but about strategic impact. She hadn't needed to raise her voice to be heard. She had simply needed to stand firm in her worth and activate the networks of respect she'd built through years of service. In doing so, she had created a slightly better world for her child and countless others who would no longer face the same dismissal she had experienced. Sarah's story reminds us that change doesn't always come from dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, the most powerful responses to injustice are calm, strategic, and systematic. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination that went unchallenged? What might have happened if someone with influence had taken a stand? Comment respect. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or background, for veterans watching this, we honor your service. The uniform may change, but the respect you've earned should never diminish. Share your stories of how military training helped you navigate civilian challenges. To expectant mothers who have faced dismissal or discrimination, your strength doesn't go unnoticed. Your focus on bringing new life into the world while standing your ground is worthy of admiration. This story shows how one person's refusal to accept disrespect can create ripples of change that benefit many. Sarah didn't just win her battle. She improved the battlefield for those who would come after her. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories New. Help us reach 10,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing you powerful stories of dignity, courage, and the quiet heroes creating change in our world. Together, we can ensure respect becomes the standard, not the exception.